This is Mark Turin on the 2nd of September 2004 in Ithaca, New York, and it gives me great pleasure, it's a great honor for me also, to sit here with Professor Terence Turner, Professor of Anthropology at Cornell University, recently retired, and to sit here with Terry asking a few questions about life, research, studies, students. Perhaps, Terence, we could start off with some basic biodata. Where were you born and to whom?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, though I was born on the last day of 1935, and I remained in Philadelphia somewhat less time than I had been inside my mother. I think we moved about 4 months later to Wilmington, Delaware, and then to Frederick, Maryland. My father, this was the Depression, of course. My father had just gone to work for the Maryland State Board of make work, I don't know. It's what became, at the federal level, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which he then went to work for. He was very much a Roosevelt New Deal man, and he went on to work then in the federal government in Washington on all the programs that the Republicans had just dismantled, you know, aid to dependent children, aid to the industrially handicapped, et cetera, et cetera. And he stayed in Washington until, on that kind of job, until the Republicans were elected in 1952, whereupon he went into foreign aid, as it was then called, in which he worked until he finally retired. But that meant that I grew up essentially in a kind of liberal public service kind of atmosphere. My parents' closest friends were social workers and government bureaucrats. My mother had been the librarian of the Pennsylvania School of Social Work where my father took a degree, and so my mother, and she was also the principal of a school. She had actually taught and became principal of the American Community School in Beirut, Lebanon, as part of the Mennonite Relief Fund after World War I. This will tell you that my mother came from a big Mennonite family and colony in the Midwest in Goshen, Indiana. My father came from a Presbyterian, his father was a Presbyterian minister, and so they were basically middle Americans, you might say, but of progressive persuasion. My mother was a published poet and quite an erudite person, and someone who continually either taught or administered educational or outreach programs all their life.
Did she publish under her maiden name or under Turner?
Violet Bender, her maiden name.
Mm-hmm. And you were one of how many children?
3, oldest. I'm the oldest. My brother, 2.5 years older, who, well, he is an investigative journalist, and my sister, 2.5 years younger than that, is an administrative law judge, also now living in Philadelphia, so returned to the roots, as it were, although she actually was born in Frederick, Maryland. So we came from middle Atlantic sort of stock.
What can you tell me more about your parents' respective ancestries? And were grandparents or great-grandparents or uncles and aunts a significant part of your growing up?
Yes, they were. Well, my mother's mother, my grandfather died before, on that side, died before I was born. But my mother's mother was very much part of our early life, and we did go out several summers to Goshen, Indiana, and spend time out with her relatives. My father came from quite a large family, just like my mother. On both sides, well, my father had 5 sisters. He was the only male. And my sister had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And all of them had families, so that I had lots of cousins. And, well, they were, you don't want to know about all their professions and so on, but it was, I grew up as part of an extended family.
Was your family quite international? You mentioned the Beirut connection already after World War I, but...
Mennonites are very international. I mean, my mother's eldest brother who was very influential in the whole family. He was the first Mennonite from America to hold an advanced theological degree from Tübingen in Germany. And he had become involved in contacting Mennonite colonies before World War II. There were many German speaking Mennonites in Russia and Ukraine, and also Mennonite and Hutterite colonies up in Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan. The Mennonite colony from which my mother's family came had started out in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, then went up by covered wagons to Ontario, Kitchener, Ontario, and then back down to Indiana. But they maintained contact with Mennonite colonies all over the world. And my maternal uncle, Wilbur Bender, the one I'm talking about actually is Harold Bender, went around the German-speaking countries of Europe to antiquarian bookstores, searching for and finding many Renaissance period Anabaptist documents, including lots of Bibles, community Bibles, where the records of genealogical records of births and deaths were kept. And of course the communities that these Bibles had been part of and served had all been wiped out, massacred, or forced to, ethnically cleansed by the Catholic reaction after the Counter-Reformation. In my mother's family, the ascending generations, some of whom were still alive, I got to know as a child, always used the term "the war" to refer to the persecutions of Maria Theresa of Austria, who is also, I think, the model of the Queen of the Night in the Magic Flute. It's an international review of sorts.
Absolutely. Did this or anything else lead to early travel in other countries with your parents? Was that a luxury that your family could afford at that time?
No, we traveled a good deal in the United States. My father's idea of broadening travel, and it was a good one, was to take us around, for example, the great New Deal projects like the TVA in Venezuela, in Tennessee, and national parks in the Southwest, Grand Canyon, and so on.
Was it quite a political upbringing in that sense, that you were being confronted with parents, friends who were, you say, social workers or involved in administration, bureaucracy, and working towards building a better country? When I listen to music of that era, it's always much more politicized than the music is of these days.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was political and romantically nationalist. It was how a person could be a Republican was something I grew up without being able to understand.
What was your schooling like? What kinds of schools did you go to? And
public schools. Well, until the end of my second to last year of high school, which was a Maryland public school. But then I got a scholarship to a British school. This was a scholarship offered by a fund that had been established by British parents whose children had been sponsored by Canadian and American families in the early years of the bombing in World War II, when many children were evacuated to North America. And then when the V2 bombs came in, and it was very dangerous again in London, more children were evacuated. And so the parents of these children put up a trust fund called the Kinsman Trust, which brought Americans, preferably children of the families who had sponsored their children, over to Britain to some educational establishment, everything from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art to so-called public schools, British-style public schools. And I just applied for this when eventually they decided to spend down their capital because there weren't really any more children of those parents. Everybody was too old, So they established an open competition in American public schools, and I happened to get one of those things, and so I ended up finding myself in a British public school, but a very odd one, because it was co-educational, an offspring of a school founded in the Lake District by the son of Arnold Rugby, the famous rugby school.
What was the name of your school?
St. George's in Harpenden, Hertfordshire. So I learned to play rugby and write in a certain way and talk, I guess.
It must have been very competitive, and I'm sure it was a prestigious thing to get the scholarship to go to the UK for 1 or 2 years?
Well, it was potentially 2, but I did go for 1 because I then got in. I got into Harvard, which I applied for from the American Embassy in London. I could have stayed in my British school long enough to pass advanced level school leaving certificate, A levels. But I had been put in what was called 6B. You don't know what 6B. That's the lower sixth form.
Yes.
Where all the people in the lower sixth had already taken O levels, ordinary leaving certificate. So I didn't take that. If I had gone on to university in Britain, which I had never had any intention of doing, I would have had to stay, of course, to take A levels.
Sure.
But instead, I got into Harvard, and I decided I would just go on to college in America at Harvard. I thought that I would be able to transfer my credits from Britain to my American high school, and thus get a high school diploma, some kind of certificate. But the Maryland State Board of Education refused because I had not taken the required course in American history, which was not offered in this British public school, and so I was put down and still am in the Maryland statistics as a high school dropout.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
A little more on the British experience, if there are stories to tell. Were your family quite Anglophilic? Was it a good thing that you were going to England, or this is, I suppose, early middle 50s now we're talking?
Well, actually, yes, 1952, 53. Anglophilic, no, but they were both. They had both done English literature, and they were. They'd been very good students. They went to Oberlin College. That's where they first met each other, and they could quote vast stanzas or stretches of, especially the Romantics. Shelley, Wordsworth, Byron, etc., etc., etc. Also Shakespeare. So to that extent, they had sort of. They also knew a lot about American poets and literature too. But beyond that, they weren't particularly English-oriented. I think they had some good British friends whose political orientations were similar. There were socialists, one kind or another, either Labour Party people or someone to the left of that. But otherwise, they were not. They had no aspirations or what do you call it? I don't know, Anglophilic orientations to British class structure. They were very anti-imperial and so on.
Do you have fond memories of your time in the school in St. George's? And how was it different at the time to what you'd experienced in American public school?
Oh, it was extremely different. I really hated American high school and junior high school for a variety of reasons. It was a time when American culture was sort of at a nadir of kind of conformist, I thought, kind of really banal I don't know, popular culture, and there was McCarthyism. It started up, and well, what else? I mean, how to explain it? I just didn't. I really hated the culture of the thing, and I thought that the attempt to create a democratic, quote, post-quote, culture in American schools by having elections based on popularity and nonsense like that. It was basically disgusting, and I felt really alienated. And to go to Britain, to a public school in Britain, well, it was, needless to say, extremely different. I mean, there I was basically with a lot of rather snobby class, upwardly mobile. This was not the creme de la creme of British public schools, but it was a school for people whose parents sent them there to acquire the trappings of class if they didn't already have them. And so there was that kind of social ethos, which I thought, well, I found was quite alien. But nevertheless, it went along with a kind of intellectual culture and certain kinds of, what shall I say, dialogical skills and so on, that one was expected to learn, and there were quite clear-cut rules. And athletics was the same way. I mean, I rather enjoyed rugger, especially, and how to say it. One knew what the rules were, and one was expected, perhaps, to try to get away with breaking them, but to take responsibility if one was caught. I mean, there was none of there was. The result was, I thought, a much more highly individuated sort of character that was developed. I liked the product in many ways, even though I sort of disliked, even despised in some ways, the politics that it came from. Mm-hmm. So it was I thought, intellectually, the exposure to kind of close reading. This was our teacher was a Levi-Strauss from Cambridge, who was steeped in that level of, at that period, you know, of close reading, close criticism, sort of the equivalent of American new criticism, but with a much heavier emphasis on morality and ethics and so on of text. And it was all, I thought, it was a very intensive, and I thought for me, an extraordinarily stimulating experience.
Do you retain friendships from that era in the UK?
Only very vaguely. I went back the last time I was in Cambridge, in England, as a visitor in the department. I went back and visited a couple of old school friends, which was pleasant. But I don't really keep up from that time in England. My English friends come from later periods.
Finally, if I may ask about the school and then move on. You were maybe the single or maybe one of a handful of Americans in the school. I don't know. But
there was one other.
Were you well received, and were there prejudices for or against you at that time in England?
Well, there was a great deal of competitiveness between England and America. I mean, England was still a world military power, and there was a lot of, and after all, it was only, 7 years after World War II. A lot of London was still bombed flat, and lots of English cities were still in ruins, and people remembered the war very vividly. There was still rationing, for example, and sort of lousy food and poor heating and so on was a point of national pride, of course. And I was rather big for my age, for my British cohort, and somehow this all coincided with my first exposure to rugby and things like that. And so there was a good deal of roughhousing, which, a lot of it was put on the footing of, well, who was better, the British Navy or the American Navy, or the British Air Force, the American Air Force. I had very definite opinions on that subject, but even if I hadn't, I was expected to produce a certain answer to these challenges, and which led to a good deal of scuffling, but it was all in good fun.
So thereafter, a scholarship to Harvard or admission to the college?
Both.
Great. And with already a direction to study something, or how did you enter, and with what aspirations?
Well, I didn't have much direction. I was, in some ways, I mean, socially, I was really rather poorly prepared for the social universe of Harvard. I mean, the whole prep school culture of America was very different from high school culture. Although about 50% of Harvard by that time was drawn from high schools. And on the other hand, I mean, I had 1 year in this British public school. That didn't make me a public school boy in a British sense either. So I was not, well, then as now, Harvard had rather uneven standards of teaching, education. I don't think that it's a particularly good school for teaching. And, well, I learned a lot. I liked it, but I guess my main personal orientation was political. I mean, I became president of the Harvard Liberal Union, which under my presidency declined from a membership of official membership of somewhere, I guess 50 or 60 to something like 5 or 6. I mean, this was when the liberal aspect of Democratic Party politics and so on was in a really steep national decline. And
what year did you start Harvard?
It was September of 1952. I was the class of 1957. So it was really the most dismal period of post-war American politics. So my main activities as a student, besides classes, were politics, liberal politics as they were then called, and also rugby and a few other sports. But I put a lot into rugby. I became a captain of the Harvard team and so on.
Were the classes stimulating? Did you have some professors who...
Some were. A lot were dull as nails, even, I thought, really badly taught. But
any particular highlights or professors whose classes you remember? And
well, oddly enough, some of the ones that I remember best were not among the best taught, but it's just the subject matter I was so interested in. I liked some of the history of science classes. I ended up majoring in history. I also did a lot of literature in the sort of new critical vein, analysis of text, literary critical stuff. There was a discipline about that kind of the reading of text. People still believe that there was such a thing as literature and text and so on, and that one should really acquire a certain set of analytical skills and how to write the ability to write critical essays about text and so on. And I think that that training in literary analysis by the standards of that time, even though I thought that there was something really desperately wrong with new criticism, because it was based on abstracting criticism from any connection with social context, social analysis, and so on, and that was obviously dumb, or it was wrong. At that point, I was still, well, I had what became part of my anthropological perspective, I guess. I thought you have to analyze things in a historical and social context to fully understand their meaning, and this was, of course, just the opposite of the new critical approach.
Was it at Harvard that you had your first interface with anthropology, or was that before?
No, I had been interested as a kid in, well, mostly in archaeology, ancient history, and things like that. But I didn't go in for studying those things in college because I thought that they were, in a sense, guilty pleasures. I mean, they were socially and politically irrelevant, and that was a kind of antiquarian indulgence. So I did modern history, modern European mostly, but also American, 19th and 20th century.
Was the war, as in the Second World War, not as in... was that a major part of understanding where the world was going? Was it taught as a contemporary issue, or was it taught as a historical issue already?
Well, let's see, how was World War II? I didn't actually take any courses that focused on the history of World War II, although it came in various ways, in various courses, in formation of modern politics or histories of various countries, including U.S. of A. It certainly came in. I had read a lot of military history. I still do. I mean, for me, it's a fascinating subject, and it certainly was part of my own ideas about the formation of current contemporary politics, and it still is.
Did you take any anthropology classes at Harvard? Or
I started to take one, and it was so awful that I quit the class after about 4 weeks.
Who was it taught by?
Clyde Cluckham, who was very famous, and he spent the first lecture or two making embarrassing apologies for the terrible ratings that the course had received in the student guide to Harvard courses, where he was panned as a dreadful lecturer, and he was a dreadful lecturer. And I thought it was embarrassing for the man to be doing a terrible job of lecturing about how terrible a lecturer he was. So I walked out. I thought I'd never take another anthropology course. Well, I mean, that lasted until graduate school. I found myself going into anthropology.
You graduated, you say, in '57
Yep.
from Harvard. Was there a clear sense of what you would do next? Was there pressure from your parents to go and get a real job and enter the workforce?
No pressure, no clarity, no ideas really about what the hell I was going to do, except go into the Army, because I had gotten student deferments. I was still in a generation of American men, obviously, at the time, who, if you had if you got 2S student deferments, you were supposedly going to be liable for the draft until the age of 36, whether or not you were married or in a profession or something. And so the smart thing to do was, one way or another, get your military service over before you started having a life. So there had been universal military service up to just about the time I graduated, and there was then a program where one could opt for active training for 6 months and then be in the active reserve for 5.5 years, which involved going for weekly meetings and summer camps and so on. So I thought that seemed like the least troublesome for. So I went in as an enlisted man for 6 months, and I did, basic and advanced training in artillery. I became an expert in firing an utterly non-functional but highly technologically advanced anti-aircraft gun, which never worked. And eventually I think it was all sent down to the Venezuelan army without ever seeing action.
So that was immediately after Harvard, after graduating, 6 months. Where were you based in your 6 month training period?
Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic, and then Fort Bliss, Texas. Ironically named. It's in El Paso, and it was not very blissful. that was the anti-aircraft gun training.
And thereafter, you emerged with a training in a non-functional weapon.
Yeah, I had, it was, when one wasn't doing the actual work with the anti-aircraft gun, time hung heavy on one's hands. So I did a lot of reading in the post-library, trying to decide what the hell I felt interested enough in doing to choose a career of one kind or another. So I had found that reading, kind of psychology, sociology, culture, history, things in the general area of social science, or even what we'd call cultural studies, I suppose, today, were the things that I was most interested in reading. So I decided I would go to graduate school, and in some academic thing. I had done, as I say, history, modern European history, in undergraduate school, and so I applied to graduate school in history, modern European history. And I chose Berkeley because I'd been out there on a rugby playing tour, and I rather liked California. It was the first time I'd ever been there. It was very different from Cambridge, Mass, and I felt I'd had enough of Harvard and Cambridge and so I went to California. And this was the year before the free speech movement. This was, it was 58, 59, yeah. And at that point, Berkeley was, and I guess all California universities were, it was a real culture shock. It was the first and maybe last time I've really had such an intense culture shock type experience. It was like a glorified high school. Everybody walked around just robot-like, obeying the rules, except for a handful of, a rapidly growing handful of sort of rebellious types with whom I made friends. A lot of them went on to organize what became the free speech movement. At that time it was called SLATE. There was a slate of student candidates who were running against the administration and so on. And against, of course, it was both in support of things like the civil rights movement, black liberation movement, and also Vietnam War was starting up. Anyway, so that, I don't know, I was sort of peripherally involved in all that sort of thing, and at the same time I was trying to figure out if history was really my thing.
You'd applied for graduate school in history.
And yes, and I was there. Yes, I had been, and I was, you had to take an MA and then go on to a PhD if you made the MA. And I got involved in doing social and economic history, basically. David Landis, who's just acquired sort of fame in the subject.
Young Prometheus?
That's right. And Henry Rosofsky, who later became Dean of Harvard, who was an expert in Japanese Far Eastern economic history. He and David Landis gave a good seminar in social economic history. And I took other courses of intellectual history and so on. Anyway, I realized that the kind of history I wanted to do was always, at least in terms of history as it then was taught in America, sort of on the fringe of kind of a more theoretical, more culturally and socially, sociologically contextualized sort of historical interpretation, and not the rather positivist and kind of not all that overtly interpretive history that one was taught in most of the history classes that I had taken at Harvard and took at Berkeley. And I decided I liked intellectual work. I liked academic life, I thought. But I didn't really particularly like history. I thought it was kind of flat-footed and intellectually uninteresting. I think history's changed a great deal since then, but anyway, so by a process of elimination, I sort of asked myself, what am I really interested in this stuff, and what is the discipline that really teaches it? Sociology? Well, sociology had a lot of the kind of flat-footed, positivist kind of approach that I also didn't like much in history, and also it seemed it didn't get involved in questions of cultural interpretation and so on, or much about psychological interpretation. I sort of had an interest in, I don't know, cultural interpretation of psychology or psychological interpretation of culture. Thanks. And on the other hand, psychology, personality psychology, clinical psychology, and sort of psychoanalytic interpretations of historical and so on, although it was fun to read them, it really lacked either much of a historical or a firm theoretical sociological basis. So by elimination, I thought, well, anthropology is sort of open to all those. It does all those things, or at least potentially does. It's where you can do cultural and social and even psychological kinds of interpretation. And historical, all at the same time.
Yes,
so,
it was a subject which you had a rather negative experience of back in Harvard.
I had. So I decided I should apply in anthropology and go on, see if I could do a degree in anthropology. And then the question was where. I really didn't like California, and I didn't like Berkeley. I didn't like the big rah-rah fraternity and big athletic sort of stuff. I played rugby for Berkeley, but that was another story. Basically, it was a kind of academic culture that I thought it reminded me a lot of American high school. I really didn't wanted to get the hell out. As I said, if it had only been the next year, it would have been fantastic. But it was the last year of California universities as a kind of infantilized high school kind of thing. So I decided, having decided to leave Harvard and Cambridge and to get out to California and try something new, I ended up deciding to go back to Harvard, not directly in anthropology, but in something that was then called social relations, which was a combination of sociology, anthropology, a promising discipline called social psychology, which has since been liquidated, and other psychology, clinical psychology. So I went back to Harvard and I took my PhD in social relations with a concentration in social anthropology.
Had Berkeley offered you a studentship for a certain number of years, and therefore did you have to say that?
No, I had won an independent scholarship for, well, it was good for 4 years, but I could take it wherever I wanted.
So you took it back to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Social relations, is this a department or a field or a faculty which still exists?
It was no. It finally self-destructed. It was really primarily formed by Talcott Parsons, the sociologist, who was a man with imperial intellectual ambitions. This was going to synthesize psychology, all those things, social psychology, sociology, anthropology, all together in his general theory of action, which was a kind of deactivated Weberian position. I don't want to get off into that, but anyway.
But was this what you were finally looking for in graduate school, where Berkeley had not delivered? Was it stimulating? Was it interesting? Did it attract and appeal?
Yeah, a lot of it did. I learned to sort of, it turned me against psychology, psychological anthropology, for the most part, which I thought of as it was practiced in America, and that America was the country where psychological anthropology had been really developed, and I thought it was...
What did it mean in that time? What was psychological anthropology standing for in the late 50s, early 60s in the States?
Well, it involved the application of psychoanalytic concepts and to some extent learning theory concepts to cultural patterns and to some extent some social patterns like kinship patterns and so on, but in ways that really abstracted from a sociological context of analysis. And I had, doing French social and economic history in Berkeley, I'd read a lot of Durkheim and the année sociologique and the French sociological tradition, going up from actually from the 17th, 18th century, going up through Saint-Simon and Comte and Fustel de Coulanges, and then up to, as I say, Durkheim and his students and the année sociologique. So I arrived there at Harvard, having sort of read a lot of that stuff, and I saw that the American psychological anthropologists, who perhaps unfairly epitomized at Harvard by John Whiting and his wife, who had what seemed to me a really aggressively simple-minded approach to doing a kind of crude psychological statistics kind of analysis, and they openly spurned the kind of social theoretic traditions, well, not only of the année sociologique, but of British social anthropology, which was at the time still quite strongly based and rooted in the Durkheimian année sociologique tradition. And the same went for Weber and whatever came from Germany. All the things that I felt. Basically, I had become converted to someone who believed in social theory in that sort of more European sense. Although there were social theoretic ancestors also in American social thought, but none of them seemed to play into the psychological anthropological tradition as I was exposed to it anyway. And so I, in my first year of graduate school in social relations, where I worked some with Talcott Parsons, taking seminars where Parsons' theoretical scheme was, I thought, a real dead hand. But he provided a shelter for people to read all the great social theoreticians, with one exception, which you can probably guess. You couldn't quote Marx in a Talcott Parsons seminar. But Weber, the année, also British economists like Alfred Marshall, and people who had a kind of a social dimension of economic analysis.
What was he like to be in a seminar with? Do you have any reminiscences and thoughts about Talcott Parsons? For me,
Yes.
It's just a name. It's a book. It's a famous person.
Yes, he was. He paid attention. He listened. He responded. He was a pretty good seminar leader. He was, of course, enormously egocentric and authoritarian in a sense, but he was also rather gentle and encouraging for anyone who showed some kind of an interest in social ideas and so on, theoretical ideas.
Did you dare raise Marx? Did you bring him in occasionally into seminars and risk the wrath?
I didn't know anything about Marx at that time. Really knew virtually nothing. I mean, I'd read a few things as an undergraduate, Manifesto and so on, but I didn't know anything about Marxian theory. And my politics weren't really, in any sense, Marxist at that point. They were still kind of, maybe social democratic, I guess, but not Marxist social democratic. And that all came rather later, Marx. But anyway, Parsons also, to give him his credit due, he was a fantastic lecturer. He had an extraordinarily clear mind, and he could walk into a classroom without any notes and produce a 56-minute lecture, exactly 56 minutes if it was an hour lecture course, where everything would have come out as if it were a set of Roman numerals with sub A, sub B, and he, with that together with the readings, was a good exposure of a certain kind. The only problem was then it ended up in these fourfold boxes and things like that, which was just...
But what held the department together, social relations? Was there a methodological or a theoretical underpinning which meant that all students or PhD students at that time would be schooled in a similar way of thinking about the world and would construct PhDs from that perspective?
Parsons and his system were the most, the closest that anybody came to providing a kind of common foundation. But really, I mean, the anthropologists, anthropology students, there weren't that many, there were maybe half a dozen a year who were admitted in social anthropology. And they took some courses in the anthropology department, which continued as a department of biological and archaeology and, quote, cultural anthropology to one side of the social anthropology department. And in fact, Kluckhohn, as the leader of the anthropology department, had a falling out with Parsons. He had been part of the social relations department, but had left it and had gone off to champion the sort of more desocialized cultural anthropological point of view. So the anthropologists sort of bridged two worlds in that sense. The psychologists weren't interested in Parsons, by and large. The social psychologists, who were doing things like small group analysis and Kurt Levine kind of field theory, things like that, got over a little bit into some of Parsons as he sort of used some of their ideas. But anyway, mostly it was a rather eclectic mix that really didn't have any comprehensive theoretical framework. And indeed, after Parsons retired, it really fell apart.
So you're describing really a department spearheaded and dominated by one intellectual heavyweight who brings it together. And with his departure, then the end of that.
Yeah, although I think some of the other members, particularly perhaps psychologists, would have objected to being left out of the list of heavyweights. And I think that they thought that they were pretty heavyweight guys.
Your PhD, what was it on, and how did it take shape?
Oh, it was on the Kayapo. Like I say, at the end of my first year, I had taken another disasters course with Kluckhohn, as it was required of first-year people in the anthropology program. Course in anthropological theory. Well, that succeeded in convincing me that I really was not, if that was anthropology, I wasn't going to be an anthropologist. But at the same time, I had learned more and more about British thinkers, anthropologists, going from Radcliffe Brown to Fortis and Evans Pritchard, little bit of Leech at that point. And I could see that there was a great deal of continuity between them and the French. Also, our introductory seminar, for the sociologists, no, the social anthropologists in the social relations department, was run by Evan Vogt, and his way of running it was to just assign the total works of some anthropologists to each student, who then had to read the whole oeuvre of, say, Margaret Mead or Julian Stewart or Evans Pritchard or something, and report to the class. Well, there was this guy I'd never heard of, a French guy called Levi-Strauss, who at that point was largely untranslated. And it turned out I was the only member of the class who read French. So I was assigned to read Levi-Strauss and report to the class. And, well, none of my colleagues, that is the other students my year, had heard of Levi-Strauss either, or certainly if they had heard of him, had never read him. And I don't think Professor Vogt had heard all that much about Levi-Strauss either. But anyway, he tossed me Levi-Strauss. And so the result was that I really started out my first year of anthropology reading as much as I could manage of Levi-Strauss. I mean, Les structures élémentaires de la parenté, I'd never had any kinship before. I had very little idea of the Morngin system. Well, anyway, there was that, and Tris tropique, and anthropologie structurale. Anyway, I found it both interesting and kind of repellent in some ways, and I thought that there was something really wrong with structuralism, its predilection for static paradigms from which all kind of syntagmatic ordering had been abstracted. I mean, you couldn't, to say that you're analyzing myths where what you do is strip out the entire narrative structure of the story and just reduce it to so many jigsaw puzzle pieces of logical oppositions between signs and so on. It seemed to me to be an obviously crazy way to proceed. So I wasn't captivated by it, but on the other hand, I thought it was fascinating to look at that level, at that detail, at the content of the signification, so to speak, of bits of stories, and look for patterns in them, not just of stories, of course, cosmologies, classifications, kinship systems too, in different terms. And so I thought the big challenge of structuralism was to kind of amalgamate that kind of approach with a kind of social, contextual approach. And then in the next year, David Maybury-Lewis came to Harvard from Oxford. He was a student basically of Needham. And he, because of Needham, he also was very strongly grounded in analyse sociologique and Durkheim. And he was kind of committed to a kind of social critique of Levi-Strauss as well. And so I found myself doing reading courses with him, and talking about the analyse sociologique people and Levi-Strauss, and taking his kinship course and so on. And he of course had worked with the Apuin-Chavante, who are Ajay-speaking people in central Amazonia, central Brazil. And at one point he suggested to me that I should think of doing something like that. I had decided that probably what I would end up doing as an anthropologist was to go to France and study maybe some kind of industrial suburb of banlieue of Paris, and maybe compare what happened to people in those big apartment blocks that were being built to the way they lived with each other in the villages, provincial villages from which they'd come. Because what the French were then doing, factories like Renault, for example, were taking workers from a single area or village and putting them all in the same apartment block and so on. So there was a kind of interesting study, a comparative study. Anyway, I thought that maybe that's what I'd do.
Were you, as a graduate student at Harvard in social relations with a focus on anthropology, constantly encouraged to try and find a field location, and were you on the lookout for one?
Yeah, yeah. So this was, I started my first year, as I say, I had this idea about France, and Lawrence Wiley, who was an anthropologist who wrote a famous book called Village in the Vaucluse, and some other books about France from a kind of a cultural anthropological community study point of view. So I had started working with him, but then, for reasons I've said, I got over into working with Maybury-Lewis, and he suggested that I think of going to work in the Amazon on this large and still very little contacted Jay-speaking group called the Kayapo. And I thought, why not, what the hell? It sounded like something really challenging and great and interesting, and so I decided to do it.
What year are we in now? I know you went to the Kayapo the
Second
first
year.
time, I think in '62.
That's right.
So we're now a year or so before that.
That's right.
Maybury-Lewis, what was he like as a teacher, as a mentor, as a professor?
He was very young. He was, I should actually add, his wife was also important, Pia Maybury-Lewis, a Danish woman who, well, they were great people. They were very good hosts, and they had students around, unlike many Harvard professors who never let a student pass the threshold. Some did, some were not like that, and David was well, in age, he was very close to us. I mean, he was only a few years older, and he was very accessible, and I found there was a good deal in common intellectually and so on. So, well...
Did he become your PhD supervisor?
Yeah, he did. Well, if under those circumstances, if you go and work with a Jay-speaking Amazonian tribe, chances were very heavy that David Maybury-Lewis was going to be your supervisor, as indeed he became. So that's the way I sort of found myself going down to Brazil and working with Kayapo. I have to say, I thought at the time it would be great, and kind of intellectually, kind of a unique opportunity to work with a virtually intact culture, as I thought the Kayapo would turn out to be, where you could get to know everybody, all the individuals of the community, and maybe even all the Kayapo individuals. I didn't really know nobody knew how many there were. And know the entire culture. I thought one could learn. Learn the language, learn everything. And so you could really do a kind of a totalizing global analysis. The other kind of influence that was very important for me was doing linguistics, structural linguistics, field linguistics.
Who was it taught by?
A series of people. It was in the first great years of Chomsky and the Chomskyan critique. But before that, of course, there had been American descriptivism, Sapir and Bloomfield and people like that. And there were lots of ideas about the microanalysis of semiotic forms. And I found that stuff fascinating. In a way, it was a kind of continuation of some aspects of the interests I developed in as an undergraduate in analysis of texts.
Did you take then linguistics classes, which then fed into...
I did.
the research?
And I was interested in some of the philosophical issues. I went down to MIT and audited some couple of classes of Hilary Putnam, who was interested in the philosophy of language, and Roman Jakobson was still lecturing at MIT and came to Harvard every once in a while to lecture.
How was he as a lecturer?
Wonderful. He was like a Stanislavski actor, he was a theatrical figure, just a marvelous and magnetic person.
What kinds of things could you do to prepare for field work, and what tips did Maybury-Lewis or others give you about entering Brazil, living there, working with people who are poorly documented?
Well, learn Portuguese. So I took a summer school course in Portuguese. And learn the theoretical issues about analyzing these communities, which, you see, at the time it was thought that all these J communities, being matri, uxori local, were matrilineal, or, as Maybury-Lewis had found, patrilineal, but anyway, they're based on descent, unilineal descent, and exogamous relations between descent groups, either moieties, exogamous moieties in most cases, or in the case of the Shavante that Maybury-Lewis had worked with, it seemed to be they had kind of a tripartite division. But anyway, the emphasis was on sort of, I don't know, a kind of an analysis of the corporate divisions, and underneath that level, families and domestic groups and so on, with an emphasis, and this was turned out to be extremely important. Maybury-Lewis had really introduced this into studies of Brazilian societies, of the developmental cycle of these groups, how they went through a series of changes in their composition over phases of between formation, dispersion, and so on, and how the dynamics of this process tied into the kind of political organization of factionalism and so on. And that was, I took that with me to the Kayapo. But David was antipathetic to the idea of field methods. And I mean, his attitude was rather, this is not something that he said, but it's something that someone else said, which sort of evinced his attitude when this person, I forget who the hell it was, some anthropologist, was asked what his methodology was. He replied, my methodology is to eat a bowl of Wheaties and then run 5 miles in the morning. The idea was, if you're any good, you get to the field, you speak a contact language, you have to learn the local language, and you do a genealogical census, and then you sort of go from there. You figure out what's going on. But how you do that? Well, if you can't figure that out, you don't belong in anthropology. So to hell with field methods questions. I mean, that was his sort of approach. I hope I'm not being unfair, but anyway, that was sort of my attitude too. I mean, you could have, having read a lot of anthropology books, but also history books and whatever, you have an idea of what putting together a study of a certain, I don't know, problem or set of facts is. And all of the nonsense about statistical testing and other kinds of questionnaire stuff, the kind of stuff that was floating around in social relations because of the psychologists and sociologists, seemed to me to be just irrelevant.
So you didn't leave the field then with a theoretical or intellectual agenda which you were testing or setting out to prove?
Well, really, there was, I suppose, a sort of an agenda. Basically, I had to write a field grant application. Yeah, and I made that as a kind of study of moiety systems and what the basis of moiety organization was. Can't remember the details. It turned out to be totally irrelevant because the Kayapo moiety system, I found, had collapsed. There were no moieties anymore. Not only that, but there was no descent and no exogamy. I mean, the Kayapo had a kind of a bilateral kindred system with age sets and ceremonial associations and very elaborate ceremonial system, but no, quote, dual organization or moiety structure, no exogamy, no descent, nothing, none of the things that up till then had been thought to be the central aspects of Central Brazilian social organization. And so it was start over, which was very much the sort of situation which I guess in a way my training, or rather my anti-training, had prepared me for, you know. It then became, well, quite difficult to actually talk about this with David Maybury-Lewis. I thought that, look, the Northern J systems, there are many of them, and they all turned out, almost all, to have no descent and not to be exogamous. And so they weren't, many of them had moieties, however. And I thought, look, you can't explain these systems as essential in Levi-Straussian sort of terms. That is, they're not systems of exchange, of exogamy. They're not tied to marriage at all the way that exogamous moiety systems were supposed to be. And so you need to think of a completely different theoretical frame of reference for the interpretation. What is the relation between these collective systems, these institutional forms, and the substratum of families and domestic groups and that sort of thing? And I came to think that, in fact, you could understand, in each case, these collective systems were symbolic extrapolations of the key moves that people made in these lower-level domestic group cycles and so on. They regulated the reproduction of these domestic groups and families, and for that matter, of social persons, because social persons were largely constituted by the kinds of positions, statuses they occupied in families and domestic groups, and that the collective groups that were founded on that were, in a sense, kind of generalized projections of these patterns that were continually reproduced in the domestic group and family cycle and person cycle. I got very interested in Kayapo bodily decoration when I realized that it's very complicated, the body painting and the kind of ornaments, ear plugs, penis sheaths, lip plugs, and so on. They're all bestowed in certain rites of passage at certain stages in the life cycle, which are the same key moments of transition in the family cycle and domestic group cycle. And that meant that male and female persons at different stages of their cycles became little microcosms of the congeries of relations in the domestic and family cycles, and also, of course, in a kind of microscopic sense of the whole macroscopic structure of the community. It became impossible to explain these ideas to David, at least at that time, and he thought
this is all on returning from fieldwork, or did you communicate with him by letter from Brazil?
Yeah, every once in a while I'd send a field report or something, but also then after I got back and was writing my thesis, I think it kept coming out that he thought that I was trying to do a reductionist interpretation, that the whole collective structure was, institutional structure was a projection of it was determined by the domestic group and family thing. I kept saying that, no, actually I thought I was trying to describe a feedback system in which there was both a top-down and a bottom-up kind of influence. Well, I was starting to think of such systems in terms of something called a dialectic. By then I'd been starting to read Marx. And also I was starting to think of social production as something that had to be thought of, especially in societies like this, where there was no commodity production, no market, etc., as the production of social persons and households and families, and that these institutional structures were ways of regulating social production in ways that, among other things, involved relations of exploitation, gender exploitation, exploitation of juniors by seniors, and all that. Well, this fell on ears which, well, were not prepared to agree anyway, and I think that this was true for most of my colleagues in the Central Brazil Project, the Harvard Central Brazil Project, including Brazilian anthropologists.
What was there a project? There was an organization which was holding.
Yes, David had the idea of organizing a controlled comparison of the different J societies. It's a natural context for that, rather like the Western Pueblos that Fred Egan had written in his famous book. So that's the way I had gotten my grant before. I was the first, anyway, to go down, but then David got this grant for something called the Harvard Central Brazil Project, which also, which had a very good idea of that a number of Brazilian anthropology students would go up to Harvard and be part of the department and also get money from this grant to do research on other Central Brazilian societies, people like Roberto da Mata, Julio Melati, Roque Laraya, people who've become very important in Brazilian anthropology. And at the same time, of course, we would go down and take courses in the graduate program of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which was the leading, at that point, graduate social anthropology program in Brazil. And so this all happened, and this was all David's creation. It was a great idea, great project. But somehow, intellectually, it never really came off. I mean, we published a book together called Dialectical Societies, but you can read in the introduction how my interpretations were described as the sort of odd person out that I was some kind of Marxist reductionist, whereas the others were doing their Needham-esque sociology kind of, I don't know how quite to describe, but anyway, yeah, if you're interested, you can read that introduction.
That was published post Fieldwork, I take it.
Absolutely.
After writing up.
Absolutely, yeah. It was published, actually. It came out after a number of years, 1979, I think it was.
Right. Two thoughts on what you've been saying. Firstly, on relations with David Maybury-Lewis. Professional disagreements aside, could you nevertheless still continue to work with him? And did he understand that your analysis might be different, but that it was functional and cohesive within his own understanding and own paradigm? Or were there tensions already then?
Well, yeah, there were tensions because I couldn't understand why it was so impossible to explain and get David to understand at least what I was trying to do, that I was trying to talk about a feedback system between levels rather than simply a reduction of everything, all the upper levels, sort of to the most basic level. I thought you could agree or disagree with that, but you can at least understand it's not such an unknown or a difficult idea. I mean, Gregory Bateson had been writing about this for 40 years by the time I was...
So why his resistance? What did you attribute it to?
I don't know. I don't know what made it so hard, and I won't speculate. but it was hard, and I sort of eventually gave up. Well, I got my PhD, and I mean, he didn't block that, although his comment on my thesis was, actually it was a slight paraphrase of a comment that Evans Pritchard had made on someone else's thesis, as I later found out, but it was something like, Professor Turner has made an interesting contribution to Central Brazilian ethnography. It is difficult to say, however, in exactly what this contribution consists. Punkt. Yeah? Anyway, I got this degree, and I got a job at Cornell. This was at a time when jobs were not given or gotten by placing ads in something like the American Anthropology newsletter and having people apply and get recommendations. It was like, at least in the elite departments, if you needed a job, or you needed to hire some particular kind of person, you just called another elite department and asked the chair of the department if they had anybody coming along in that subject, and if so, well, they were just told to send him along, and we'll, ask him to give a paper or something, and then if it works out, fine, we'll do it. So, in my case, it was Alan Holmberg, who was the author of a book, a very widely read book called The Nomads of the Long Bow, and also was running a kind of applied anthropology project in Vicos, Peru, who had discovered that he had a fatal case of, I guess, leukemia or lymphoma or something, which had been caused by his having been left by a careless x-ray technician on an x-ray table for a couple of hours or something instead of for the requisite 10 seconds or something. And so he was chair of the department, but he wanted to replace himself in the department with someone who was doing Amazonian anthropology. And so he called up Harvard. It was Professor Bowett who was chair. Asked if they had anybody, completing a PhD in Amazon anthropology. And Bowett said, "Yeah, well, we've got young Turner." So, well, send him along, send him along. So I showed up at the airport, and Alan Holmberg picked me up, and I don't know exactly at what point they decided to give me a job, but in the next couple of days, and so I found myself with an offer of a job. I had also managed to score a Fulbright to go to Paris and work in the Laboratoire Ethnologie Comparée with Levi-Strauss. And so I had to choose between Paris and Ithaca. And oddly enough, I chose Ithaca. I thought, look, I've had enough of kind of being a graduate student and reading theory and so on. I'd love to live in Paris for a while and, work with Levi-Strauss to the extent that's possible, and all the rest of the things that one could do in Paris. But I thought it was time for me to see, really, well, if I could actually stomach, I guess is the word, working in an American academic context. I mean, one of the things that Harvard PhD, which I never thought was worth the paper it was printed on, had left me with was a really deep disgust for the bad teaching and the lack of intellectual commitment and the theoretical banality and I thought it was bad, and I thought the human relations among the faculty and between the faculty and a lot of the students, or between the students and a lot of the faculty, were awful, and that it was a terrible way to live, and I didn't want to I thought that being outspoken, I didn't want to live any other way, would just, if in a place like Harvard, would very swiftly land me in trouble, and I would never have a prayer of staying and getting tenure. Influential in this judgment was what happened to another teacher of mine, Tom Beidelman, who's now at NYU, who took a principled position against giving a PhD to a protege of Talcott Parsons and George Homans, who were members of the social relations department. And as a result of this, Parsons and Homans really, they considered this a kind of lèse-majesté, and it was inconceivable. This young assistant professor, who was a relatively flamboyant character, didn't conform to all the Harvard academic stereotypes, should actually resist them and veto or vote down the thesis of their protege. And certainly, when he capped this with statements like, anyone who could accept this thesis has to be either dishonest or incompetent. Well, Homans and Parsons had both already approved it. Well, it sort of sealed his fate at Harvard. But I had thought, he was, for me, the teacher with the most, integrity and passion for his subject and so on. And I thought I could see myself ending up, as he did, leaving the place where he was an assistant professor and working at another institution. Well, Tom has done, of course, very well in the end, but it was a kind of scene that I could see myself getting into.
I'd like to ask you a couple of things, backtracking somewhat, rewinding.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, about Levi-Strauss,
Mm-hmm.
the possibility of going to work with him in Paris, which you forego to come to Ithaca. Did you ever end up working with him or meeting him?
Oh, often. In the next, decade, I guess, after this, after coming to Cornell. I taught at Cornell 2 years, 67, 68, 66, 67, and 67, 68, and then went to the University of Chicago. But between 67 and 79 or 80, I guess, I was in Paris fairly frequently, and whenever I went, I would pay a call on Levi-Strauss, who had read things by me, especially my thesis, and would amaze me by asking questions about, on page 362, you say that the term for mother's brother is blah, blah, blah. And this was at a time, for example, when I had just dropped by without any prior appointment, so he could not possibly have swatted up in advance. And why would he have swatted up in advance, to impress me? Come on. So he actually was a rather special scholar. He's incredibly widely read, and he would love to talk about, Brazilian ethnography and ideas about it. He liked speaking Portuguese. His Portuguese is excellent. So even though my French is okay, we almost always spoke in Portuguese, and it was very, very pleasant.
The second question I have is about partners. Did you leave to the field the first time in 62 with a girlfriend, a wife?
Yeah, I've somehow, the way the conversation has gone, I've sort of missed a number of crucial stochastic turnings in my life. This was, Joan Bamberger, and I got married, met in Harvard Graduate School. She was a student in the Department of Anthropology, had just come over from archaeology into cultural social anthropology, and we sort of got together and went down, we got married and went down to the field together. She also wrote a thesis about the Kayapo, Conceptions of the Natural World, and we stayed together for 7 years and then got divorced amicably and are still friends.
Was fieldwork therefore an easier experience, having a partner with you, a wife, who could mediate? At least you could speak to her in the evenings and talk about all the things that happened in the day, or how was the interaction in the field with your partner?
Oh, it was a great deal more comfortable and pleasant in a variety of ways than just being there alone. Kayapo, especially at the beginning, were not the easiest bunch of people to just kick back with. I mean, they were not only, in many cases, Gorotire, the community that I started working with, was a place which had a core group that had been part of the community when it made peace in 1938 with the Brazilians. But it consisted of about a half of its population was that core group, and the other half were much more recent immigrants from other communities, which in some cases had only been pacified in the Brazilian sense, that is, established peaceful relations with the Brazilians for 4 years. Communities like Kubenkraken, for example, and the Mekrano-T groups from the west of the Xingu. People like that had been, their relation with the Brazilians was very like the relation between Apaches and Mexicans in the days of Geronimo. I mean, it was a very active military raiding situation, and so they were not, and they were never defeated in any battle with Brazilian police or army forces. They were seduced by offers of presents in exchange for settling down. But they had lost none of their propensity for aggressive bluster as a way of getting their way. It was fairly hairy at times. And also the Brazilian agents of what was then called the Indian Protection Service were, in some cases, they were corrupt and sleazy bastards who had their own ways of trying to do you in. And so it was not a situation which, would have been particularly pleasant or easy as a single young man. I think it was, on both sides, it was a lot easier and a lot better, a lot more pleasant to be a couple. For both of us.
What fieldwork like, though? You set off for your first piece of anthropological fieldwork. It's a very exciting thing, probably quite a nerve-wracking thing to do, to a place where little is known, maybe some guidance from Maybury-Lewis about how to get somewhere, but you arrived in Brazil. Where did you take it from there? How did you
because of David Maybury-Lewis's contact with Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, who was a Brazilian distinguished social anthropologist, who was running the program, the postdoctoral student program it's postgraduate program, the Programa de Pós-Graduação em Antropologia Social, the postgraduate program in social anthropology at the Museu Nacional, which was set up as a kind of graduate department. The first step was to find a place to live in Rio and join the kind of ongoing seminar that Roberto Cardoso was running at the Museu Nacional, which was reading works of social anthropology, both Brazilian and foreign. It was like a seminar with Brazilian graduate students, yes, graduate students, and well, me, and Joan, and then later other members of the Harvard Project who did that seminar for a while. It was a context. I stayed in that context for about 3 months, where I got my Portuguese a great deal better, and also learned about how to get into the interior. At that point, it was well beyond the frontier of Brazilian settlement. There was no surface transportation, but the Brazilian Air Force mail service, it was called the National Postal System, the Correio Aéreo Nacional, the National Airmail System, which basically used World War II C-47 transport planes, bimotor transport planes, and sometimes Catalina flying boats, PBY flying boats, often with repairs from the war, and there would be these wartime designations and stuff where obviously had been used in the U.S. Air Force or something. They flew into the interior at airstrips that were established at these Indian service posts, one of which was Gorutire. So the idea was you got your field kit together, went down to the office of the Correio Aéreo Nacional at the airport of Rio de Janeiro, and you flew in. It took about 3 days to get into because it was a milk run thing. We kept landing at various places going across Brazil until you got into the interior. And then you got there, and it was up to you to negotiate to get a house built or whatever.
Were you the first anthropologist who had worked in that area? Or had there been reconnaissance visits from the Brazilian administration beforehand to find out who was there, how many people?
Well, there had been an Indian service post established and a mission of the unevangelized fields mission that had been established there since 1938. But there had been anthropologists with the Kayapo, not with the Gorutire, but with other groups, to the east, a large group that had become extinct, actually, by then. German anthropologists, Fritz Krause, Ehrenreich, Kissenberth, people like that, Snethlage, mostly out of Leipzig. And German ethnology was very active in central Brazil at the latter quarter of the 19th century and the beginning, first 2 decades or so of the 20th century. And then, of course, the greatest of all those figures, Kurt Unkel, who's adopted the Indian name of Nimwindaju, so Kurt Nimwindaju, became the greatest of all Brazilian ethnologists. He arrived, I believe, just after the First World War. And he worked with the Kayapo for a while. Didn't publish on them, but except for one little article, and then something that he wrote together with Robert Lowe, full of really bad misinformation, saying that they had matrilineal exogamous moieties or something totally untrue. But I found his untranslated German field notebooks in the archive of the Museo Nacional, and this is an advantage of coming into anthropology from doing European history, where I could read German, and it was very useful to have those field notebooks, and also to have read Krause and Kissenberth's and notes on the Kayapo. So I had that start, as well as Nimwindaju's great monographs on the Eastern Tibira and the Apinagé and so on, there are other Northern Jay societies which are very close to the Kayapo in many ways.
Was fieldwork, though, the anthropology that you've been looking for? Having had some rather unsatisfying lectures as an undergraduate and then graduate back at Berkeley, and then of course at Harvard, was fieldwork where it came alive? Was it exciting? Was it wonderful? Was it challenging in all the right ways?
Yeah, it was exciting and challenging. It wasn't always wonderful.
Did you get ill? Did you have...
Sometimes I got ill. But basically, I got ill coming out of the field into cities like Rio, Sao Paulo. I was pretty healthy in the field. It's a healthy life. It's a healthy environment. The food is great. Wonderful game, fish. A lot of protein, a lot of very varied garden produce and wild produce. It's a good life. Other things being equal, when we started out with the Kayapo, however, the Kayapo were in pretty desperate straits because they had accepted the Brazilian offers of peace and so on, but in exchange for promises of periodic infusions of presents, gifts, and so on. But of course, those became fewer and farther between the more peaceful they became, and there was a lot of tension over how essentially poor they had become. I mean, in their natural, that is, their pre-peaceful contact state, they weren't poor, and they didn't have the problems with epidemics and disease and so on that they've started to have as the result of the contacts that they were having with Brazilians. But now, that's not to say, however, as I came to realize, that they hadn't become dependent on Brazilian manufacturers and commodities long before they made peace. I mean, they had really they had developed a kind of raiding economy where every year they would go out and acquire new supplies of ammunition, colored cloth, firearms, steel tools, pans, metal pots, and there was only one way they could acquire those, basically by raiding Brazilian settlements, and mostly that meant killing the people who had owned them. So they were sort of, quote, Apaches in the American stereotype or Mexican stereotype of that kind of relation. So for them, making peace had been sort of, to turn Clausewitz on his head, a kind of continuation of war by other means. It was a different way of getting goodies.